What's the darkest secret you found out about a family member/relative? Story 1. My dad was born in rural Texas in 1915, the youngest of 10 kids, all born a year apart. His oldest sibling, Henry, was about 11 years older than him. Tragically, my grandfather passed away in an accident not long after my dad was born, leaving Henry, at the young age of 11, to take on the role of man of the house. When my dad was about 9 years old in 1924, a gang of men swept through their small town, abducting children to work as slaves on cotton farms nearly 400 miles away. This horrific crime, as unbelievable as it seems today, was apparently not uncommon at the time. My dad and two of his siblings were among the children taken. Henry, now 18 years old, returned home from a cattle drive about a week later to find his mother devastated by the disappearance of her children. Determined to bring his siblings home, Henry strapped on his late father's dual-holstered 6 guns and set out to track down the kidnappers. He gathered information from townsfolk and followed rumors, riding empty train boxcars and even atop moving trains. After weeks of relentless pursuit, his search led him to a few cotton farms where he believed the children might be held. My dad, who was only 9 at the time, became emotional every time he recounted this story. He and 2 of his brothers, along with about a dozen other children, had been imprisoned on a cotton farm for over 2 months. Forced to work under the blazing Texas sun, they were locked in a barn, fed scraps and beaten if they resisted or cried. Hope seemed distant until the day they heard Henry's voice calling their names. They looked up to see Henry approaching. As they ran toward him, one of the captors on horseback began shouting. Without hesitation, Henry drew his gun and shot the man. My dad wasn't sure if the man was armed, but at that moment, it didn't matter. The gunshot alerted other captors, 2 of whom rushed to the scene, only to meet the same fate. Henry's focus was singular: get his siblings home. He embraced my dad and simply said, "Let's go home." The journey back west to their small Texas town involved hopping train boxcars, often sharing space with other rescued children. When they finally arrived, their mother fainted upon seeing them. Henry put away the 6 guns that had saved his family and never touched them again. Remarkably, there was no investigation or legal repercussions for what had occurred. Texas in the 1920s still echoed the lawlessness of the Wild West. Years later, all the brothers served in World War II and returned home safely. My dad only shared this incredible story after Henry's death. I had always known my Uncle Henry as a gentle, soft-spoken man, barely 5'4" and weighing around 100 pounds, who owned a small printing shop. Never in my wildest dreams would I have imagined him capable of such bravery and heroism at the age of 18. Story 2. My mother allegedly has a fraternal twin, though the story remains shrouded in secrecy and denial. When my grandmother gave birth, she couldn't handle the thought of raising 2 children. She gave the male child away to someone she knew who was moving far away. The truth came to light in a heated moment when my grandmother, in a drug-induced rage, screamed at my mother, "I kept the wrong child." My mother was 12 at the time, and this shocking revelation was never mentioned before or after that night. Desperate for answers, she asked my great-grandmother, who confirmed the boy's name, but had no idea where he'd been taken or who was raising him. My mother later realized she had unknowingly met her twin once as a child, but had no idea of their connection. When she confronted my grandmother, she denied everything. My grandfather, on the other hand, believed the story couldn't be true, reasoning, surely they would have had to tell me. But deep down, I doubt he was ever told. Years later, while my mother was pregnant with me, she asked my great-grandmother what my middle name should be. The name she suggested turned out to be the middle name of my mother's long-lost twin. Story 3. My great-uncle is a predator targeting underage family members. Though it's not openly acknowledged, my grandparents know the truth, as do his victims, my mom, my aunt, and several cousins. The family's response: silence, because he found Jesus again. And apparently that means everyone has to forgive him and pretend it never happened. This all occurred before I was born, but the weight of it was passed down to me. My grandparents never explicitly discuss it, only making vague comments like, "Tony did bad things, but he's a changed man now." However, growing up, I pieced together the truth from my mother's history of assault and her obsessive vigilance to keep me and my female cousins away from him. Now that I'm in my 20s, this unspoken responsibility has been passed to me. At every family gathering, it's my job to ensure no child is ever left alone with him. I can't explain why. I just have to quietly intervene, shooing children away, scooping up toddlers from his arms, and acting like I'm merely overprotective. The charade is exhausting, but I've had enough. I refuse to protect a rapist for the sake of keeping the peace. The next time I have to take a child out of his grasp, I plan to walk straight to their parents and tell them the full story. I'm done staying quiet. This family may want to hide the truth, but I won't. Story 4. My biological grandfather was a dangerous and volatile man. While my grandmother was still very young and pregnant with my uncle, he threatened to kill her. The situation was even more complicated because he was engaged to another woman at the time. The stress and fear turned my grandmother into a nervous wreck. She became a recluse, afraid to leave the house, and he escalated his harassment by throwing bricks through her windows. Terrified, she eventually confided in some friends about the threats he had made. Not long after, he disappeared without a trace and was never seen or heard from again. Over the years, our family joked about what might have happened to him. Perhaps one of her friends had threatened him or run him out of town. The darker possibility that someone might have killed him for her was also tossed around, always with a touch of morbid humor. But the jokes took on a chilling undertone when we discovered something unexpected. While sorting through my grandmother's old photos and love letters, we found evidence that she had been friends with the infamous Cray twins. Suddenly, the mystery of what happened to my grandfather seemed much darker and far more plausible. Story 5. My uncle has a chilling story from his childhood involving his older brother. One morning, his brother invited him to go hunting in the woods near their house. They set off early and ventured much deeper into the woods than usual, straying far from the familiar trails. As they walked, my uncle noticed that his brother was letting him take the lead, falling further and further behind. Eventually, my uncle stopped and turned around, only to see his brother raising the shotgun in his direction. Alarmed, he asked him what he was doing. His brother hesitated and quickly replied, "Oh, I thought I saw something." Feeling uneasy, my uncle decided to head back home immediately. A few days later, curiosity got the better of him. He returned to the area where they had been and found a freshly dug pit a little off the trail. From that day forward, he never went anywhere alone with his brother again. Years later, as the story circulated in our family, more details about the older brother's personality came to light. He was a narcissist who prioritized his big dreams over any loyalty to family. He eventually abandoned his responsibilities, including his marriage, and ultimately died of a drug overdose. My uncle believes that his brother had planned to kill him that day, but either hesitated or decided it wasn't the right time. While we'll never know for sure what truly happened in those woods, the fear in my uncle's voice when he tells the story makes it clear that he genuinely believed his brother was capable of fratricide. Story 6. My grandfather, who passed away in 2017, was always a quiet man, and it wasn't until a few years before his death that I learned why. When he was around 10 years old, in the late 1930s or early 1940s, he accidentally killed a girl his age. They had gone out into the woods with his rifle, shooting at random things. On their way home, they encountered a fence. My grandfather leaned his rifle on the fence to help the girl climb over, but the rifle fell and discharged, killing her instantly. Although the authorities found him not at fault, the girl's family harassed him, standing outside his house and yelling "murderer" for weeks. Unable to bear the guilt and accusations, he ran away from home. In his teens, he befriended a man named Rocky, who later passed away. My grandfather assumed Rocky's identity, which explained why his last name differed from his brother's. Decades later, my father, who was adopted, discovered his biological family through DNA testing. To our shock, his biological father had a nearly identical story. As a child, he had also accidentally killed someone, fled his home, and adopted a new identity. Story 7. 2 years ago, I discovered that my mother had given up 2 babies for adoption. One 18 months before I was born, and another when I was 3 years old. Each child had a different father, and I suspect the only reason she kept me was that my father married her, though their marriage only lasted a year. My mother remarried when I was 5, and my half-brother was born when I was 7. For 59 years, I believed he and I were my mother's only children. I never saw her pregnant with the second baby because she sent me to live with my great-grandparents across the country during her pregnancy. Only my mother and grandmother knew about these adoptions, and they both took the secret to their graves. The truth came to light because of modern DNA testing. Meeting my half-siblings, a sister older than me and a brother younger than me, has been a positive experience. However, the initial discovery deeply affected my sense of identity and my view of my mother. Story 8. My parents always claimed they were married in secret until they found out my mom was pregnant, at which point they told their families. However, the truth came out years later. They actually got married on the same day they learned about the pregnancy and lied to everyone about it. The bigger revelation came when my dad, an only child idolized by his devoutly Catholic parents, found out a similar secret about them. After my strict conservative grandparents passed away, my father discovered that their wedding license was dated 2 months after the date they always claimed to have been married. While not a dark secret, it was definitely a very Catholic secret in a very Catholic family. Story 9. For years, I was told my birth father had died in the Navy before I was born. Years later, I discovered this wasn't true when I learned my birth father was alive and living in California. Things became even stranger when a sister I was told had died at birth reached out to me, revealing that she had actually been adopted. Piecing together the family history, I learned that my grandparents, mother, then 16, and uncle, then 14, had been stealing cars in Southern California and running them to Tijuana. When the Fed started investigating, the family fled to Central America. My mother, pregnant with me, eventually made it back to Texas, where I was born. She gave me the name of her last boyfriend, claiming he was my father and that he died in the Navy. Less than a year later, she gave birth to my half-sister and put her up for adoption, telling everyone she was stillborn. If that wasn't enough, I later discovered that my grandmother had been a prostitute, madam, and arsonist. But that's a story for another time. Story 10. My parents had a bitter, contentious divorce that often involved them bad-mouthing each other in front of us kids. Most of the time, I ignored their immature remarks. But one day, my mom crossed a serious line. While my siblings and I were watching TV, we started talking about our dad's upcoming visit. Overhearing this, my mom stormed into the room and blurted out, "Did you know that your dad was molested?" My dad had never mentioned this deeply personal experience to me or my siblings in the 18 years I lived with him. To this day, I don't know why my mom thought it was appropriate to reveal such a sensitive and private matter to us, or why she seemed to think being a victim of abuse reflected poorly on him. It was a bizarre and incredibly unsettling way to learn something so significant about my father. Story 11. I'm the only child born to my mom and dad, but they each had children from previous relationships, making all of my siblings 15 plus years older than me. When I was 7, my parents split because my dad had feelings for my mom's oldest daughter, yes, my stepsister, who already had 4 kids. Disgusting, yes, but they were both adults, so it was somewhat brushed off. Fast forward about 13 years, and suddenly my dad became very involved in the life of one of my stepsister's kids. 20-year-old me didn't question it much at the time, but 7 years later, I finally pieced together the truth. My dad was actually the father of that child. All my life, I thought she was my niece, but in reality, she was my half-sister niece. I've never talked about this with anyone in my family, and my mom passed away before I figured it out. The thought of how much pain this must have caused her haunts me. But the story doesn't end there. We're from Mississippi, so cue the deliverance banjo. My dad, born in 1945, is extremely racist, like super racist. The kicker? My half-sister niece had 2 kids with a one-legged black man. The one-legged part isn't entirely relevant, except that he once came to my house and started doing push-ups in my living room for no reason. Karma's a bee, though. Cheat on my mom with your stepdaughter, father a child you ignore, and then watch that child make life choices that, in your eyes, are the ultimate betrayal. Chef's kiss for karma, but my heart hurts for my mom. Miss you, Cotty. Story 12. This isn't a family secret, but it's definitely a strange story. Back in 2013, Instagram was still a smaller platform. Through the app, a friend of mine found someone who was basically my doppelganger. I'm pretty unique looking, dark brown hair, fiery red beard, nearly a full bodysuit of tattoos, and golden black Ray-Ban Clubmasters. This guy had everything, the same hair, beard, tattoos, and even clothes. He was an artist who owned a gallery, while I'm a professional tattoo artist. We connected, joked around, and even FaceTimed occasionally to prove to others how alike we looked. Eventually, I had the chance to travel to NYC for work, where he lived. We made plans to meet up, take a picture together, and laugh about how uncanny it was. Then things got weird. As we talked about meeting, he mentioned that he didn't know his father, who was a traveling biker that hooked up with his mom one night. That detail hit me hard because my dad was also a notorious biker who traveled around the area where this guy grew up. Half joking, I said, "Wouldn't it be wild if your dad was James Jobin? That's my dad's name." He laughed and agreed it'd be crazy. He said he'd ask his mom about it and let me know before I arrived in NYC. Then he blocked me on Instagram, Facebook, text, everything, complete silence. I've made other accounts to check up on him over the years, just to see how he's doing, but I've never reached out again. It's bittersweet. On one hand, I want to respect his right to stay away, but on the other, it breaks my heart to think I might have a brother out there who doesn't want to know me. Story 13. I found this out just 2 weeks ago. When I was a teenager, my grandmother started dating a rough and dangerous man. For about 4 years, we rarely saw her unless it was to pick her up from the hospital after he had beaten her. At the time, I assumed our family was just disappointed in her for staying with him. Recently, during a visit from my mom, I learned the real story. My grandmother's boyfriend was actually a large-scale drug dealer who openly and violently beat people in public without any consequences. The police wouldn't pursue him, and those who knew who he was were too afraid to press charges. My mom and her sisters approached county law enforcement about him. When they mentioned his name, the officers physically recoiled, gasping in fear. They told my family they couldn't discuss the man further without consequence. At the time, my dad worked for a major hotel and resort and had connections with a retired Secret Service agent who handled the resort's security. My dad asked him to make some inquiries. 2 days later, an FBI agent showed up in my dad's office, flashed credentials, and said, "Let it go." After my dad explained the situation, the agent repeated the warning and left. The man remained in my grandmother's life from 1993 until 1997, when he died of a heart attack. My grandmother passed away just a few months later. To this day, we have no idea who he truly was. We've speculated everything from mob ties to a high-value witness protection participant. At 40 years old, I still don't have answers about this dark chapter of my family's history. If anyone has ideas on how to research something like this, I'd love to know more. Story 14. About 10 years ago, during the time when historical Sewell assault cases were heavily covered in the news, my Nan, whom I was very close to, confessed something deeply personal to me. She told me that her brother had tried to rape her when she was a teenager. I comforted her and didn't tell anyone else. After she passed away, I learned that my dad also knew about the assault, though he believed it wasn't just an attempt, but that it had actually happened. He even suggested that this trauma contributed to his parents' divorce, as it caused issues with intimacy in their relationship. My Nan always had a distrust of men and often claimed to hate them, but despite her pain, she led a full life with many friends and accomplishments. It broke my heart to know she carried such a heavy burden for so long without proper support. Ironically, the day after Nan's confession, I was with my other grandmother. She mentioned that all the news coverage of Sewell assault cases was making her recall something that happened when she was a young girl. My heart sank, thinking there was yet another traumatic story in my family's past. Thankfully, it turned out to be much less severe. She'd been flashed on a bus as a child. While still awful, it was a relief after what I had learned the day before. Story 15. This isn't the juiciest story, but it caused some real confusion when my husband and I applied for our marriage license. His name wasn't actually his name, or at least not officially. We needed his birth certificate for the paperwork, so we ordered a copy. To our surprise, the certificate listed his name as John Jones, even though his license and all other records said John Schmidt. My husband swore that when he got his license 20-plus years ago, his birth certificate also said John Schmidt. However, the clerk's office said that was impossible. They only had John Jones on file. After a lot of calls, research, and frustration, we pieced together what must have happened. Back in the 1980s, his stepdad, Papa Schmidt, informally adopted him. Instead of going through the legal process to change his name, the family simply started using the last name, Schmidt. Somewhere along the way, my husband thought it had been officially changed, but it never was. We spent $300 to make the name change official so his legal records would match, but we still can't explain why he remembers having a birth certificate that said Schmidt. Either it's a false memory or a glitch in the universe. In any case, his name is now officially Schmidt, and I'm proud to share the same name. Story 16. For context, my dad is the second youngest of 15 siblings. His oldest sister has a son, Vince, who is about the same age as my dad. Growing up, Vince and my dad were close. Vince even stood as a groomsman at my parents' wedding. A few years later, Vince became very religious, aggressively trying to convert family members. He'd switch churches every month, and his behavior started to raise eyebrows. When I was about 1, there was a family gathering where Vince and his girlfriend made everyone uncomfortable, preaching about damnation and demanding people attend his services. My mom, who had taken me to another room because I was sick, overheard Vince and his girlfriend discussing who they could target for money. Vince specifically mentioned my dad, saying he'd be easy to convince and could fund their endeavors. Alarmed, my mom told my dad, who confronted Vince. A huge argument broke out and Vince left, calling everyone Satan and saying they were all going to hell. The family later pieced together that Vince was a con artist. He'd been kicked out of multiple relatives' homes for mooching, stealing, and refusing to work. By the late 1980s, Vince had disappeared, but his absence caused a rift in the family. Two aunts and several cousins refused to attend gatherings where Vince wasn't welcome, believing he was the Lion of God. When my grandmother passed away in the mid-1990s, one of those aunts brought Vince to the funeral. Vince was warned to behave, but it was clear his influence over her was strong. Later that night, I did some digging online and discovered that Vince was the leader of a religious cult. He'd convinced about 30-40 people, including two aunts and 7 cousins, to give him their money and possessions in the name of serving God. He targeted immigrants, making them work on farmland he owned while he pocketed the profits. To this day, Vince's cult is still active, and former members have created websites to expose him. It's chilling to know he's still out there manipulating people, including some of my own family. Story 17. This isn't really a secret, just a strange part of family history. In the late 1960s, my maternal grandmother's husband divorced her and was granted partial custody of their 2 sons. During one of his visitation days, my grandmother took off with the boys and moved them from North Dakota to California. Her entire family was part of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is known for being a tight-knit community. When she got to California, she settled in a heavily Seventh-day Adventist area, knowing the community would protect her from authorities. There were no allegations of abuse against her ex-husband. She was just angry about not having full custody. This arrangement lasted from about 1968 to 1971. Eventually, my grandmother had a falling out with either her adoptive mother or a cousin. That relative contacted her ex-husband, who then came to California and took the kids back. Surprisingly, my grandmother didn't face jail time for the kidnapping, but she was stripped of visitation rights and hasn't seen either of her sons since 1971. The Seventh-day Adventist Church later introduced her to another member, who became my grandfather. Neither my mom nor my aunts have ever met their half-brothers. Story 18. I'm not sure if this qualifies as a family secret since my mom grew up in a small town where everyone probably knew, but it's a dark piece of our family's past. When my great-grandmother died, my grandma was only 4 years old. Her father eventually remarried a woman who had children of her own. This step-great-grandmother was abusive, beating my grandma and her siblings horrifically when their father wasn't home. She would also lock them in the basement all day. This trauma left lasting scars, and unfortunately, my grandma carried on the cycle of abuse with her own children. One of my great-uncles turned to alcohol to cope with his childhood. He also developed a strange obsession with grave robbing. He had a fetish for gold teeth and also stole jewelry and other valuables, which he would sell to buy booze. My mom remembers him showing up at their back door, covered in dirt, looking for food and clothes. Her mother would always help him out for a while, but he'd inevitably go back to drinking and robbing graves. For years, I thought he died in an accident, as my mom always said. However, a few years ago, one of my uncles told me the real story. My great-uncle passed out drunk on someone's front lawn. The homeowner called the cops, and when the police arrived, they tried to arrest him. He woke up during the arrest and resisted, leading the officers to kill him. Story 19. This one might truly take the cake. I come from a deeply violent family, a cycle that goes all the way back to our immigration from Ireland, where the family name was changed after being disowned. One of the most horrific stories involves my aunt, who is actually the child of my grandfather. On her wedding night, her father raped her, with the help of her new husband. She grew up not knowing that her grandfather was also her biological father. She lived with him for most of her life, oblivious to the truth. At some point, I believe she figured it out. They had a huge falling out, during which she physically attacked him, something completely out of character for her, as she has the mind of a child. Sadly, this isn't an isolated incident. My family history is riddled with stories of rape, school violence, and extreme abuse, including my own father. He was a saint in public, but a monster behind closed doors. On my mother's side, things aren't much better. They are all Jehovah's Witnesses, and my father thought that joining them might be a way out of this toxic cycle. It wasn't. I've completely cut ties with both sides of my family, except for my 2 older sisters. Story 20. My wife's origins are both shocking and complicated. She is the result of a one-night gangbang with a soccer team. Growing up, her mom couldn't or wouldn't tell her much about her father. She showed her pictures of the team from that night and pointed to one man saying his name was Martin while spinning a half-true story about him. Fast forward 30 years, and I used DNA testing to track down potential candidates for her father. I narrowed it down to a few brothers who were all on the team. To confirm, we needed a blood test. One of the brothers, Bobby, claimed he was her father. He admitted to using Martin's name when hooking up with women. One of the other brothers, who was single, agreed to take responsibility for her to avoid further family complications, as illegitimate children had almost ruined his marriage before. We met Bobby and the rest of the family. Everything seemed to be going well. A couple of times I casually mentioned that we still needed a blood test to confirm things. Then one day Bobby pulled me aside while we were grilling. He swore me to secrecy and then dropped a bombshell. Man, we were all messed up that night. I think 8 different guys had a go at her and everyone else got blowjobs or hand jobs. As far as I'm concerned, she's my daughter, and she thinks I'm her father. The family loves her. Let's just keep it that way. I haven't brought up the blood test since. Story 21. When I was 7 and my brother was 3, our mother was giving us a bath when we suddenly heard a loud bang from the living room where my dad was watching TV. We both started crying, and my mom rushed out to see what had happened. She came back quickly, tears streaming down her face, and reassured us, "Don't worry, everything is fine. Your dad accidentally shot his gun because he thought there was a burglar." Being young and naive, we believed her. Once we were out of the bath, we went to see our dad. He was alive, sitting on the sofa, and he gave us an uncharacteristically big hug. He repeated the story about thinking there was a burglar, and even showed us the evidence. A bullet hole in the sofa, a chip in the floor tile where the bullet hit, and the flattened bullet. It wasn't until much later in life that I revisited this memory and realized the truth. My dad had planned to shoot himself on the sofa that night, but at the very last second, pulled the gun away and fired next to him instead. My mom must have known exactly what happened, which is why she came back to us in tears and quickly came up with a story to keep us calm. The unexpected hug from my dad makes sense now too. It was likely an emotional reaction after almost making a life-ending decision. Thankfully, he never attempted suicide again and is still alive and well at 65. Story 22. My grandfather worked for General Motors for over 40 years after serving in the Army during World War II. Every summer, he would travel to Minnesota for work, claiming he had to oversee operations at a plant there. It seemed like a routine part of his job. When he passed away at the age of 91, we discovered a shocking secret. He had a second family in Minnesota. My mom and her 3 sisters learned, just a day after his death, that he had fathered 4 more daughters with another woman. The general assumption is that my grandfather desperately wanted a son, but after my grandmother refused to have more children following their 4th daughter, he started a new family. Coincidentally, this was around the same time he began his business trips to Minnesota every summer. Heartbreakingly, within a week of his death, my grandmother passed away in her sleep. She had been with him since she was 18 years old, and we believe she died of pure heartache after learning the truth. Story 23. This story isn't as dark as others, but it still stings. My father passed away when I was young, and my mother couldn't handle raising me alone, so I went to live abroad with my father's sister, FS. Over the years, I stayed close to my mom, visiting and talking often, but my life was largely shaped by FS. When my mom was diagnosed with cancer, things took a turn. In the final stages of her illness, she became incoherent, talking about nonsensical things like pine cones in Finland. During this time, my mom's sister, MS, started bringing up inheritance, asking questions about what I'd be entitled to. It felt wrong to think about money while my mom was still alive, so I avoided the topic. FS warned me to be cautious of MS, hinting at some past betrayal but refusing to tell me what happened so as not to alter my view of my parents. After my mom passed away, Mississippi said we should hold off on filing for inheritance. However, I later discovered she had already filed on behalf of my grandfather, my mother's next of kin. My grandfather was suffering from dementia at the time, and MS was his next of kin, meaning his portion of the inheritance would go to her upon his death. Sure enough, he passed away just weeks later. Every interaction I've had with MS since has been about money. She constantly asks for information to further her claims on the inheritance. I've had to involve a lawyer since I'm living abroad and can't manage this in person. Eventually, I pressed FS for the truth about MS and the secret she had hinted at. That's when I learned that years ago, my father and MS got drunk one night while my mom and I were at home and slept together. They had an affair for some time. While I know it takes 2 people to have an affair, this revelation changed how I see MS, especially after everything she's done regarding the inheritance. It's heartbreaking to reconcile the fond memories I had of her as a child with the person she turned out to be. This situation has made it painfully clear how much greed can ruin relationships. Story 24. My dad had a mistress and a daughter with her, born about 3 years after me. While that in itself isn't so unusual, the way I discovered this and the events surrounding it are what make it strange. Growing up, my home life was rough, and I left the day after my 18th birthday, never looking back, especially not at my dad. I joined the military, got my life together, and eventually found out my dad had died while I was in service. I didn't attend his funeral. After leaving the military, I went to college in my home state. During that time, I met a girl, Mary, in my physics study group. We hit it off because we had a lot in common, including both being estranged from our families. We dated, lived together, had an active relationship, and even talked about getting married. After nearly 2 years, we broke up and went our separate ways. Years later, I tried reconnecting with my mom a few times, but she was always bitter and toxic, so I let her be. Now, after a stroke, she no longer recognizes me and thinks I'm her high school boyfriend. Fast forward to recently when I took a 23andMe DNA test. The results showed I had a half-sister sharing the same father. Out of curiosity, I checked her profile and instantly recognized her. It was Mary. She must have received a notification too because she contacted me through the site. We eventually talked on the phone, and she explained that she never knew who her dad was, only that he sent her mom money from time to time. I told her she didn't miss much. We agreed to keep our prior relationship a secret from both our families. If anyone asks, we'll just say we were friends in college. Thankfully, I'm not on social media, which helps. We've only spoken on the phone a few times since, and I'm unsure if I want to pursue a relationship or leave things as they are. Story 25. Growing up in Ireland, I was always bullied for having a large family. People would call me a traveler, but I thought having a big family was just a normal Irish thing. That changed in 2019 when I learned the devastating truth. Most of my relatives are children of rape, and my granddad was a serial rapist. I always felt there was something odd about my family. My grandparents were wealthy, millionaires, and they constantly handed out money to their children for therapy, rehab, or other expenses. While my relatives were capable of paying for these things themselves, the financial support was always presented as generosity. In reality, it was hush money. I am the first grandchild out of 30 who wasn't abused by him, though I didn't realize that at the time. As a child, every Christmas, the oldest grandchild was given my granddad's debit card so we could buy whatever we wanted. I thought this was just a lavish Christmas tradition. Later, I learned it was another form of hush money. In 2019, the full truth came out. After years of no reported incidents, the family assumed the abuse had stopped. Then, he began targeting younger children again. At that point, the family had had enough. They couldn't bear to see the younger generation suffer the same way, so they confronted him. Since then, many victims, including some we didn't even know about, have come forward. It's been 2 years, and while the revelations have been overwhelming, it feels like a relief to finally know the full truth. The pain is immense, but at least the family is no longer hiding the reality of what happened. Story 26. My dad grew up in Korea, and his mother never revealed who his father was. She later remarried an American soldier, and they moved to the U.S. My grandmother passed away last year, and after her death, my dad's uncle reached out to him. The uncle insisted my dad come back to Korea to visit the family, saying he had a picture of my dad's father and was ready to reveal his identity. However, the uncle refused to disclose anything over the phone, explaining that he wouldn't reveal the truth while my grandmother was alive out of respect for her. My dad, who hasn't been back to Korea in 40 years, begged for answers over the phone, but his uncle stood firm. The mystery has caused a lot of speculation within our family. My grandmother was a bitter, miserable woman who treated my dad horribly, constantly blaming and shaming him. After talking with my brothers and cousins, we began suspecting the unthinkable. My dad's father might actually be his biological grandfather. When I shared this suspicion with my cousin in Philadelphia, she didn't confirm or deny it, which only added to my certainty. My dad still hasn't gone back to Korea, likely because he's afraid of what he'll learn. The weight of the unknown continues to hang over him. Story 27. Growing up, I always knew I had an older sister. My mom spoke fondly of her and even got a tattoo featuring all her children's initials. I was told my mom had been a young mother and couldn't provide for her, so she placed her for adoption to give her a better life. But the real story is far darker. My mom was only 13 when she became pregnant by a 25-year-old man. She kept the pregnancy a secret until her 3rd trimester. When my grandmother found out, she demanded my mom get an abortion, but it was too late. Furious, my grandmother told my mom she'd be kicked out and left to raise the baby on the streets unless she gave her up for adoption. She also threatened my sister's father. forcing him to sign away his parental rights under threat of prison. Then, my grandmother arranged an adoption with a coworker who desperately wanted a child. She convinced my mom that this was the best option, promising that my sister would have a better life, and that my mom could still receive updates and possibly visit her. Reluctantly, my mom agreed, with one condition, that her daughter be named Elle, but it didn't stop there. A year after the adoption, my grandmother told the adoptive family that my mom didn't want any further contact, cutting off all updates. Adding insult to injury, she didn't even pass along my mom's request for the name, though, by coincidence, they named her Elle anyway. My grandmother worked alongside the adoptive mother for the next 10 years without ever mentioning her granddaughter again. On my 21st birthday, I found my sister. In a bizarre twist, we had lived in the same town for years, shared mutual friends, and had even crossed paths once. Unfortunately, my sister had a very rough life, and my mom now refuses to spend time with her or her children, saying she can't stand the person my sister has become. Before my grandmother passed away, I drove her to chemo one day. During the ride, she confided that her biggest regret wasn't the deception, but not realizing sooner and forcing my mom to have an abortion. It was one of the most shocking and upsetting things I've ever heard. Story 28. On my father's 18th birthday, his parents sat him down for a life-altering conversation. Without any attempt to soften the blow, they told him point blank that he was adopted. He didn't believe them at first, so his mother pulled out his birth certificate and showed it to him for the first time. There, under the mother section, was another woman's name. Under father, it simply read rape. His parents admitted they didn't know much about his biological mother, only that she was a very young girl who had been raped and gave my father up at birth. But the revelations didn't stop there. They then told him that his mom, the woman who raised him, was actually his third mother. His much older sister had originally adopted him. She had thought having a baby would be fun, but after just a few months, she realized motherhood wasn't for her. She planned to return my father to the orphanage, but when her parents found out, they were horrified. They thought it would embarrass the family. To save face, his grandparents adopted him instead, raising him as their son. From that point on, his biological sister became his sister, and his grandparents became his parents. My father was understandably in shock, frozen, as he tried to process this avalanche of revelations. And then came the final blow. His parents told him he should probably move out now that he was 18. The experience left him deeply shaken and profoundly affected how he viewed family and trust for the rest of his life. Story 29. My story isn't as shocking as some others, but it's still unsettling. I discovered that my entire immediate family had conspired with my mother to have me institutionalized, essentially locked away in a mental institution forever. The plan was meticulously detailed, and they made the mistake of documenting everything in an email thread. One of them accidentally copied me on the thread, and that's how I became aware of their plot. The level of detail in their planning was deeply disturbing. For context, I do have epilepsy, but it's controlled. Even for people with uncontrolled epilepsy, there's absolutely no justification for such drastic measures as institutionalization. This was clearly an attempt by my mother to take my son away from me. Thankfully, it didn't work. I considered filing temporary restraining orders, TROs, against them, but how do you file a TRO against your entire family? Instead, I confronted them in a long and stern conversation. A few months later, a police officer showed up at my door, saying there had been a report of neglect regarding my son. I invited him in, and it was immediately clear that the report was false. The officer couldn't initially disclose who had made the report, but I suggested it might be my mother who lived over 6 hours away. Eventually, he confirmed it was her. Since then, I haven't had any further issues with my family. That was years ago, and while the experience left its mark, I'm relieved it didn't escalate further. Story 30. This story is about my name and how it ties into my premature birth. I'm named after my father, which has always been confusing for practical reasons like insurance and banks constantly mixing us up. But the story behind my name is much darker. I was born at 24 weeks in 1987, and when I was delivered, the doctor told my mom I had less than a 10% chance of survival. He explained, either we bury the child with the father's name or without a name. We need to save room in the NICU for babies with a chance to live. At the time, neonatal technology wasn't what it is today. No specialized ventilators for tiny lungs or other advanced equipment. My survival relied on a lot of manual machine modifications that later paved the way for the technology they use now. My mom hated that doctor but had no choice but to see him during rounds. As soon as I was stable enough, she had me transferred to another hospital. I spent 6-7 months in the NICU. During that time, the nurses gave me a nickname, which I've used as my name for most of my life. My nickname and my legal name aren't similar at all, so I've always had to explain to teachers and new acquaintances why the name on paper didn't match what I went by. I didn't learn the full story behind my legal name until I was 17. My parents had kept it from me because they thought it was too dark. I already knew parts of the story. My case had appeared in newspapers and magazines, which was great for show and tell as a kid. The story comes full circle in a meaningful way. My twins were born at 29 weeks in 2017 and spent time in the NICU. One of the nurses who had cared for me as a baby was still working and helped care for my boys. She and my mom shared photos and stories, creating a beautiful connection across generations. Story 31. This story is less about dark family secrets and more about a glimpse into my great-grandfather's war stories. Both of my great-grandfathers lived to old ages, and as a child, I would sometimes sit with them and my grandfather on Sundays. I didn't speak Finnish very well, so my grandfather would often translate for me as they reminisced. During these talks, they would occasionally give me a sip of brandy or let me smoke while they told tales from their time in the war. My grandfather tended to leave out the grittiest details, but my great-grandfathers didn't hold back. Their stories were brutal, recounting acts of war with unflinching candor. They spoke about their hatred for the Nazis, but saved their deepest loathing for the Russians. They told stories of cutting off hands, tongues, and in the most extreme cases, beheading enemies and placing their heads on fence posts. I remember the cold, unyielding rage in my great-grandfather's eyes as he described cutting up a man's face, but deliberately letting him live so he would carry the shame for the rest of his life. When they talked about Helsinki during the Winter War, their pride in their homeland shone through. They believed in fighting to the death, even against impossible odds. They joked grimly that a Finnish man was worth at least 15 Russians, though they admitted that they were rarely anywhere close to those odds. While their stories were steeped in violence, they also carried an unshakable pride in their resilience and their role in defending their country. It was a side of them I didn't fully understand as a child, but it has stuck with me ever since. Story 32. My father was a serial animal abuser, and his actions are some of the most horrifying memories of my childhood. When my parents were dating in university, he beat his German Shepherd for growling at my mom and jumping on her. This behavior escalated when my older siblings were young. He would beat dogs for even the smallest perceived disobedience, calling them over and then punishing them if they came to the wrong side. He beat them so severely that they dragged their hind legs behind them. He also wouldn't let animals roam freely in the apartment, confining them to specific rooms unless they were being supervised. The worst incident, as told to me by my older sister, involved a family dog during a winter walk. My father took my siblings and the dog outside and started throwing snow in the dog's face for fun. The dog bared its teeth in response, and my father completely lost it. He kicked, punched, and strangled the dog with its leash. The dog later died at the vet, and my parents claimed it was accidental. When I was little, the abuse continued with cats. While not as extreme as with the dogs, it was still horrifying. My father once took a kitten we wanted to keep and released it by a river, making sure we knew he didn't want it. For the cats we did keep, he would beat them for making messes and rub their faces in it as punishment. The worst part was that he made us, as kids, participate in the abuse. He insisted we punish the cats in the same way he did, claiming it was necessary to teach them. We were young, trapped in a toxic environment, and didn't always have the strength to resist. While we protested when we could, I can't say I never did what he demanded. Looking back, I feel ashamed for the times I went along with it, but I've worked hard to break that cycle. Since escaping that environment, I've never hit or hurt my cat, aside from the occasional bath. If there's any justice in this world, or the Catholic hell my father believed in, I hope he is held accountable for the cruelty he inflicted. Story 33. My grandfather on my mom's side was not a good person. My mom shared her story with me, and it's one that's hard to forget. For the first 5 years of her life, she believed he was her uncle. Her mother finally told her the truth when she turned 5. At that time, my grandfather had won a lot of money, enough to send some of his children, from relationships with other women, to study abroad. However, he discriminated against my mom because she was white and a woman. While her half-siblings were given opportunities, she was stuck in their hometown, despite excelling in school. My mom and her mother were forced to live in a small room in a large house filled with my grandfather's other children. As my mom grew older, many of her half-siblings resented her because she was the daughter of a side woman, even though my grandmother eventually married my grandfather, making her the official daughter. The bullying from her uncles and aunts during her childhood was relentless. My mom married my dad, who was a soldier at the time, to gain someone's protection and finally stop her family from messing with her. Later in life, my grandfather showed no signs of redemption until his last days. When he passed, he left his properties to my mom and a few other sons. None of the other heirs wanted to care for him in his old age, but my mom did. Despite all the pain he caused her, she forgave him and took responsibility for his care. I, however, cannot forgive him for the way he treated my mom. Every time I visit his grave, I refuse to pray for him. The stories my mom told me are too fresh in my mind, and the way he treated her during her childhood is something I can't overlook. Story 34. My grandfather started dating my grandmother when he was 20, and she was only 13. Within a few months of dating, my grandmother became pregnant, but her family didn't tell my grandfather. Instead, they sent her to live with cousins hours away and told my grandfather she had left. Not understanding the situation, he got mad at her for not telling him she was leaving and didn't bother contacting her. One of her cousins adopted the baby. About a year later, my grandfather joined the army and was stationed overseas during WW2. In the meantime, my grandmother returned home and started writing letters to him. They rekindled their relationship, and after the war ended, they got married. By then, she was 17, and he was 24. They went on to have 2 daughters together. As far as I can tell, my grandfather never knew about the first baby. My grandmother passed away in 1996, and my grandfather lived to be 92, never showing any sign that he was aware of her hidden pregnancy or why she'd been sent away. I'm the only person in the family who seems to have pieced it all together. I once tried to tell my mom about it, but she refused to listen. She doesn't like acknowledging anything that might tarnish her image of her parents as the best people. So for now, this truth remains an unspoken chapter in our family's history. Story 35. My husband's grandfather, after whom both he and our son are named, had a secret that shattered the perfect family image his relatives have tried so hard to maintain. The official story is that he was killed by a drunk driver, which might still be true. But there's more to the story. From what I've pieced together, he was having an affair before his death. The night he was killed, he was visiting his mistress. This discovery added another layer of bitterness to my husband's grandmother, who had already kicked him out of the house when she found out about the affair. However, she never spoke ill of him to her grandchildren and kept up the appearance of him being a wonderful father and husband. When he died, it saved her from a divorce and allowed her to keep everything, the house, property, and the family business. But for as long as I knew her, she was a bitter and miserable woman. Whether this was from heartbreak, lack of closure, or a mix of both, I can't say for sure. What makes this even more tragic is the denial within the family. For years, they've upheld this image of a perfect small-town family, but behind closed doors, they're plagued by drama and lies. I suspected something was off a couple of years into my relationship with my husband, but I didn't feel it was my place to dig into it. The truth only came out later when my husband's mother, who herself had a string of affairs, let it slip to my brother-in-law, likely to justify her own behavior. While the secret isn't the darkest, it threw the perfect family narrative out the window and helped us understand a lot of the dynamics and heartbreak within the family. I truly believe that open, age-appropriate conversations about things like this could have saved my husband from the disappointment of finding out in such a roundabout way, especially since it seems the whole town knew except for the grandchildren. Story 36. Growing up, I believe my grandmother was one of 4 daughters born to my great-grandparents. I never met my great-grandparents as they passed away 2 years before I was born. However, while flipping through the family Bible, which listed everyone's names, marriage dates, and death dates, I noticed something strange. There was a 5th daughter written down. When I asked my grandmother about it, she revealed a story I'd never heard. My great-grandfather had been married before he met my great-grandmother. At 20, he married his first wife and had a daughter at 21. However, his wife cheated on him with a wealthy man, took their daughter, and left him to be with the rich man, breaking his heart. 17 years later, the daughter returned, attempting to reconnect and even moving in with my great-grandparents, who by then had 2 children together. From what I was told, she was condescending, frequently complaining about money and looking down on the family for being peasants. Before my grandmother was born, the daughter left again, this time marrying a wealthy man and cutting ties with the family for good. No one ever heard from her again. I feel bad for my great-grandfather. He lost his marriage and his daughter, all because of wealth. There's a good chance I have cousins out there related to this great-aunt. But no one in the family knows anything about her after she left. The family Bible revealed even more secrets. I learned my great-grandfather was a junior, but he dropped the title out of hatred for his father. His dad had abandoned the family when my great-grandfather was young, leaving to start a new life with his mistress. My great-grandfather was forced to quit school and work in factories to support his mother, who was left in poverty. Years later, when my great-grandfather was in his 20s, his father tried to reconnect, flaunting his wealth during their meeting. Disgusted, my great-grandfather told him in no uncertain terms that he never wanted to see or hear from him again. From the family Bible, I discovered not only a long-lost great-aunt who left the family for riches, but also a great-great-grandfather who was a terrible father, leaving a legacy of pain and resentment behind him. Story 37. My aunt on my dad's side discovered a life-changing secret about her origins. Among 6 siblings, 5 sisters and my father, she was the only one with a different biological father. All her life, she believed my grandparents were her biological parents, but it turned out she had been adopted as a baby. The story goes that my grandfather had an affair, and my aunt was the child of that relationship. When the biological mother signed away her rights, my grandmother decided to adopt her because she wanted to raise her husband's child. The biological mother didn't want my aunt if she couldn't have my grandfather. My aunt didn't find out any of this until my grandmother was on her deathbed, and they never discussed it further before she passed away. As if that wasn't enough, we later learned that my grandfather had fathered another child with an older woman he had been involved with. My father lived 35 years without knowing he had a half-brother who had passed away years earlier. But here's the twist. That half-brother had a son, and that son turned out to be my dad's boss. The connection was uncovered through 23andMe. My cousin took a DNA test and noticed my dad's boss in the list of people you're related to. After some investigation, we pieced everything together. My dad's boss is actually his nephew. It was a surreal discovery that tied together decades of hidden family history. Story 38. My uncle, a college professor, always made me feel uneasy, though everyone else adored him. Students and colleagues alike praised him for being charismatic and approachable, with some even calling him attractive on Rate My Professors, despite his balding appearance and middle-aged demeanor. One day, I was asked to deliver a birthday gift to him at his office since I attended the same college where he taught. When I knocked on the door, he told me it was unlocked, so I stepped inside. The room was freezing cold, and I couldn't stop shivering. My uncle was focused on his computer, barely acknowledging me. Then he waved me over enthusiastically and said, "Come here and take a look at this." When I glanced at his screen, I was stunned. He had a document open titled The List, and it contained a series of topics: dark family secrets, worst advice you've been given, job interview questions, and more. Confused, I stared at the screen as he smirked and leaned in, whispering, "Nobody knows this, but I post the exact same questions on AskReddit every week. It's easy karma farming because these questions have no moderation. Then I sell the accounts to astroturfers and start again." I didn't know how to react. The room's chill seemed to intensify, and I felt a desperate need to escape. Without a word, I turned and sprinted out of the room, not daring to look back. Afterward, I told others about the experience. While I couldn't prove what I'd seen, my story spread, and people began to lose trust in him. The respect he once commanded among peers and students waned, and his once-packed classes no longer had waiting lists. Though he hasn't been caught red-handed, I hope he will be one day. Until then, at least his reputation has taken a hit, and fewer people are falling for his charming facade. Story 39. Not much to say, except my family is a mess of selfishness and superficiality. They only care about money, their highlight reels, and showing off their expensive vacations, careers, education, and social outings on social media. Anytime I posted something online, they'd swarm on it like white on rice, particularly the women who are the biggest busybodies. I get that some of these things are worth being proud of, but they take it way too far. Out of the entire extended family, I've got one cool uncle. The rest, I probably wouldn't miss them. They left my mom out in the cold for the holidays, didn't invite her, didn't check in, just threw themselves a big party while I was 1,000 miles away. She told me she was done with them after that. But the next day, she was calling them again, desperate for their love and approval. I've distanced myself from all of them. I want nothing to do with my extended family or their kids. Did I mention that my grandma abused me my entire childhood? She never apologized for it, and no one else seems to care because everyone else was treated just fine. I was the scapegoat because my dad was in prison and I had a rougher upbringing. Apparently that made me too sassy for her liking. It's all bullsh. Story 40. Maybe not the darkest, but my family is pretty messed up, so there's a lot to unpack. On my dad's side, things have always been strange. I'm the only one in the family who ever really did anything with my life. When my parents got married, my maternal grandparents bought them a house. I was born 9 months later. Things fell apart when I was 5, and my parents divorced. My paternal grandfather told my dad to move back to California because he had nothing to keep him here. I've never liked my grandfather. He's always scheming and looking for quick money. My dad stayed in North Carolina, but in 2020, my grandfather moved out here after his wife, my dad's stepmother, died of brain cancer. My dad doesn't like him either, but pretends to be civil. When my grandfather moved, he brought along my cousin from Utah. This cousin's mom, my aunt, died in 2007 when he was just 8. His dad is in prison, so he's been couch surfing for years. At the same time, another aunt and cousin moved to North Carolina too. So for a while, 5 people were living in my dad's 2-bedroom apartment. Eventually, my grandfather, aunt, and 1 cousin moved out, leaving the cousin with no high school degree and a part-time fast food job at my dad's place. My dad and this cousin butted heads constantly, and 2 weeks ago, my dad kicked him out. He's now living with a coworker in a strange place, with no car and no education. It makes me sick that my family gives up on each other so easily. On top of all this, my dad wasn't a great father either. He used to threaten to beat me daily growing up and once even pinned me against the wall with his hand around my neck. On my wife's side, things aren't much better. Her dad cheated on her mom, left her and her 2 brothers, and married the woman he cheated with. They had a son together, and just this week, we found out they're expecting another child. Her dad is 57 and his wife is 36. That means my wife will have a half-sister 26 years younger than her, and our kids will have a half-aunt who's only a year or 2 older than them. It's ridiculous. Story 41. When I was around 10 or 12, I became curious about an aunt on my dad's side. She had adult children I'd never met. Her husband was never at family gatherings, and no one ever mentioned him. My parents also seemed to argue every time she called, which made me even more curious. One day I asked my mom if my aunt had gotten a divorce. That's when she told me the full story. My aunt had been married, but she had a severe gambling addiction that spiraled out of control. Her gambling debts grew so massive that her husband, with her encouragement, embezzled a large amount of money from his workplace to try and keep them afloat. Eventually he was caught. Unable to face the consequences, he chose to hang himself. Even after his death, my aunt didn't confront her gambling problem. For years, her family continued to financially support her, enabling her addiction. I never met my cousins because they weren't on speaking terms with her, likely due to her destructive behavior. It wasn't until her entire family decided to cut her off that she finally began to address her issues. My dad was the last to stop helping her, and he only did so because my mom threatened to divorce him if he didn't. With a young family and a mortgage to take care of, he couldn't keep funding his sister's addiction. After her family cut her off, my aunt moved a few hundred kilometers away from the casino and started to get her life back on track. Over time, she was able to reconnect with her children and build relationships with her grandchildren. While I'm glad she turned her life around, I can't help but feel sorry for everyone involved, especially her late husband, who tragically chose to steal and take his own life rather than walk away from her. Gambling addiction is truly devastating, and this story is a harsh reminder of how much damage it can cause.